How did a piece of art make you realize your entire life was a lie? I had just moved to this small town, even though my parents had fought tooth and nail to talk me out of it for some reason. But I liked it here. One of my favorite parts was this beautiful mural I passed every day on the way to work. It showed 3 young adults smiling together, 2 women and a man. The painting was so vivid and detailed it almost looked like a photograph. One morning I walked past and stopped dead in my tracks because the entire mural had been repainted. It was the same 3 people, but they all looked different. The man was taller and the women had different hairstyles. That afternoon, I asked the woman at the coffee shop next door. "Oh, that mural gets updated every single year," she said. "Do you know the story behind it? 20 years ago, there was a home invasion right here in town. A family with 4 kids. The oldest was at a sleepover that night. When he came home the next morning, both his parents were dead, and the 3 youngest kids were all missing. The police searched for months for the kids, but they never found any of them, and the case eventually went cold." I felt my stomach drop as I realized what she was telling me. The oldest sibling is the one who paints it. He never stopped looking for his siblings. He updates the mural every year to show what he thinks his siblings would look like now, hoping someone will recognize them. There's a website at the bottom if you want to read more about it. I went back to the mural after work and stood there for a long time looking at those 3 faces. I couldn't stop thinking about the mural over the next few days. I went to the website and read the whole story. The kids had been 4, 3, and 1 when they disappeared. I looked at the images again, and something about them felt strangely familiar, but I couldn't figure out what. I started walking past the mural twice a day instead of just in the morning. One afternoon, I was staring at the older woman when I noticed she had a small scar on her left knee in the painting. I pulled up my pant leg and looked at my own left knee where I had the exact same scar in the exact same place. My parents had always told me I got it falling off a bike when I was 7, but I'd never actually remembered that happening. I went home and started going through old boxes in my closet where I kept the few childhood items I had. I'd always thought it was weird that I didn't have any baby photos, and my parents said they'd lost them in a move years ago. I found my birth certificate and really looked at it for the first time in my life. The paper seemed newer than it should be for something that was supposed to be 24 years old. The next day, I called my mom and asked her to tell me again where I was born. She hesitated before answering. "You know this already." St. Mary's Hospital. I'd looked it up after our call and discovered that St. Mary's Hospital had closed 15 years ago. I called her back and asked what she remembered about when I was really little. She got defensive immediately and wanted to know why I was asking all these questions. I told her I just wanted to know more about my childhood, and she said, "I told you not to go to that town, damn it," and hung up abruptly. I started having nightmares, these fragmented memories from when I was really young of a yellow house and a woman singing and a boy's laugh. None of it connected to any stories my parents had ever told me about my childhood. I looked at the mural again and realized the older woman in it would be 24 now, the exact same age as me. I found the contact information on the website and sent a message saying I thought I might know something about his siblings and asking if we could meet. He responded within an hour and we agreed to meet at a park the next day. He was in his early 40s with dark circles under his eyes and looked like he hadn't slept well in years. He said, "Did you see someone who looks like them?" I shook my head and told him this was going to sound crazy, but I thought I might actually be one of them. I told him everything about the scar and the missing photos and the fragmented memories and how my parents had desperately tried to stop me from moving here. He pulled out his phone with shaking hands and showed me a photo. This was my sister the week before it happened. The little girl in the photo had the same scar on her knee and looked exactly like me when I was young. "I need you to take a DNA test," he said with his voice breaking. "I need to know for sure." We went to a lab that afternoon and the results came back 3 days later. I was sitting in my apartment when he called and I could hear him crying when he spoke. "It's you. You're my sister. Your real name is Katie." For a while we just sat on the phone crying together. Then his voice changed and got more urgent. "Katie, there were 3 of you taken that night. If they raised you alone, where are our other brother and sister?" We stayed on the phone for what felt like forever, both of us just crying and breathing and trying to process what this meant. I could hear him on the other end, these broken sounds that matched my own, and it felt like we were connected by more than just phone lines. After maybe 20 minutes, he finally managed to speak through the tears and told me his name was Daniel. He asked if I remembered anything at all from before, from when I was little, and I had to tell him the truth. The memories were just pieces, fragments that didn't fit together. A yellow house, a woman singing, someone laughing. Nothing solid, nothing I could hold on to and say this is real, this happened. Daniel's voice got steadier as we talked, and he asked if we could meet again tomorrow because he had so much to show me. Photos of our parents, pictures of the house we lived in, things that might help me remember. I said yes immediately because I needed to understand who I was, who I'd been before everything got stolen. We hung up after making plans, and I just sat there in my apartment staring at the walls. Everything around me suddenly felt fake, like I was living in a set designed for someone else's life. The furniture I'd picked out, the photos on my walls, even my own reflection felt wrong because none of it was built on truth. I'd spent 24 years thinking I knew who I was, and now I realized my entire identity was constructed from lies my parents told me. I picked up my phone again and called my adoptive mother. She answered on the first ring and her voice was shaking, so badly I could barely understand her hello. Before she could say anything else, I told her I knew the truth and asked her directly how she got me. She started crying immediately and begged me to let her explain in person, saying it wasn't what I thought, that there were things I didn't understand. But I couldn't do that. Couldn't sit across from her and listen to justifications for stealing someone's child. I told her no, we weren't meeting alone and that the police would be contacting her soon. She panicked then, her words coming out fast and desperate. She talked about how much she wanted a baby, how she couldn't have children of her own, how the person who arranged everything promised her I came from a mother who couldn't take care of me. She said they told her I needed a good home and she could provide that. I hung up while she was still talking because I couldn't process her excuses right then. The next morning, I was sitting at my kitchen table when my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. A woman introduced herself as Detective Caroline Harvey from the local police department. She explained that Daniel had filed an official report, and she needed to talk to me. Her voice was professional but kind, not pushy or aggressive. She told me this case connected to an unsolved home invasion and double murder from 20 years ago. She needed to interview me formally and asked if I was comfortable coming down to the station. I said yes and drove there an hour later. At the police station, Caroline led me to a small room and started recording everything. She asked detailed questions about my childhood, what my adoptive parents told me about where I came from, when the fragmented memories started appearing. I told her about the missing baby photos, how my parents said they lost them in a move, but that never made sense. I showed her a photo of my birth certificate on my phone and pointed out how new the paper looked for something supposedly 24 years old. I explained how my parents had fought so hard to stop me from moving to this town, and how my mother had accidentally admitted on the phone that she knew something about it. Caroline listened carefully and took notes while I talked. When I finished, she leaned back and explained that the FBI would probably get involved because this appeared connected to an interstate adoption fraud network they'd been tracking for years. She warned me the process would be long and hard, that there would be investigations and interviews and probably court cases. But she also said finding me alive after 20 years was a huge break in a cold case that had gone nowhere. I asked about my other siblings, and she looked at me gently and said they were still looking, but finding me gave them new hope that the others might be alive too. That afternoon, I met Daniel at a quiet park on the edge of town. He was waiting on a bench with a thick folder sitting next to him, and his hands were shaking when he saw me walking up. He opened the folder carefully and pulled out old photographs. Pictures of our parents, both of them young and smiling in ways that made my chest hurt. Photos of a yellow house with a big front porch and flowers in the yard. The second I saw that house, something clicked in my brain like a door opening. I suddenly remembered running through those rooms, remembered the feel of wooden floors under my feet and sunlight coming through windows. Daniel watched my face and seemed to understand what was happening. He showed me more photos. Me as a baby with dark hair and chubby cheeks. Me as a toddler standing next to a little girl who had to be Aurelia, a tiny baby that was Matthias. I stared at Aurelia's face in the pictures and felt this weird recognition, like looking at a version of myself I'd never known existed. Daniel's voice was quiet when he told me that Aurelia and I did everything together, that we were best friends even though we were only a year apart. I could see the pain in his eyes when he talked about losing us, about coming home that morning and having his entire family just gone. He took a breath and started explaining what happened that night as much as he knew from police reports. He was 15 and sleeping over at a friend's house. Someone broke into our house while everyone was sleeping. They killed our parents and took the 3 of us kids. By the time Daniel came home the next morning, the house was a crime scene and his whole family was gone except for the bodies of our mom and dad. I asked him why someone would take 3 small children like that, and Daniel rubbed his face with both hands before answering. The police thought at first it might be for ransom money because our parents had some savings and owned the house outright, but no one ever called with demands or asked for anything. After months with no contact, the investigators started thinking maybe the person who broke in wanted kids to raise themselves, or more likely sold you to people who wanted children and would pay for them. The fact that I grew up with people who got me through clearly illegal channels suggested someone was buying and selling stolen kids. We stayed at that park for hours while Daniel pulled out more photos and told me everything he could remember. He said I was obsessed with music as a baby and our mom sang to me all the time, which finally explained that fragmented memory of a woman's voice singing that had been haunting my dreams. He showed me videos on his phone of himself painting the mural each year, his hands steady as he updated our faces to show how we might look as we got older. When he started crying while talking about how he never stopped believing he would find us someday, I reached over and held his hand because I didn't know what else to do. He told me about Aurelia and how we did everything together, how we would hold hands and refuse to be separated even for naps. He said baby Matthias laughed at everything we did, and our parents used to joke that he was the happiest baby they'd ever seen. Hearing these stories made me ache for memories I couldn't access, for a family I should have known, but was stolen from before I could form lasting memories. 2 days later, my phone rang while I was at work, and Caroline's name showed up on the screen. She told me the FBI was officially taking over the investigation because my case connected to a much bigger network they'd been tracking across state lines. An agent named Julien Mercier wanted to interview me as soon as possible. Then she paused before adding that my adoptive parents had been told not to leave the state and were being investigated for their role in obtaining me illegally. I felt this weird mix of feelings hearing that, like part of me was glad they were being held responsible, but another part felt sad about people who raised me for 20 years facing serious consequences. Caroline gave me the address for the FBI field office and said Julien would see me the next morning at 9. The FBI office was in a bland government building downtown with tight security at the entrance. Julian Mercier met me in a small conference room, and he had this intense, focused energy that made me sit up straighter in my chair. He was probably in his late 30s with short dark hair and sharp eyes that seemed to notice everything. He explained they'd been tracking an adoption fraud network operating across multiple states for over 10 years. The network connected people willing to pay large amounts of money for children with individuals who could provide those children through various illegal means, including kidnapping. He said my case was the first time they'd been able to definitively link a kidnapped child to the network, which meant they finally had a real chance to take the whole operation down. Julian asked if my adoptive parents ever mentioned how much they paid for me, or who arranged the adoption. I told him I always believed I was adopted legally through an agency, that they had papers and everything seemed normal. But now looking back, I realized they never gave me specific details about which agency, or how the process worked. Whenever I asked questions as a kid, they got vague and changed the subject. Julian nodded like he expected that answer and said financial records would help them trace the network connections and potentially locate others involved in the operation. He asked about my childhood, whether I was treated well, if there were any signs my adoptive parents knew I was stolen. I admitted they were decent parents overall, nothing abusive or neglectful, which somehow made the whole situation more confusing. That evening, I met with a therapist named Marlene Yoshida, who Caroline recommended. Her office was in a quiet building with comfortable furniture and soft lighting that was probably meant to make people feel relaxed. Marlene had kind eyes and spoke in this calm, steady voice as she explained her specialty in recovered memory and identity trauma. She said my fragmented memories might become clearer now that I had context to fit them into, but I shouldn't force anything or assume everything I remembered was perfectly accurate. Memory is tricky, she explained, especially childhood memory, and our brains sometimes fill in gaps with things that feel real but aren't quite right. She wanted to work with me regularly to help process everything that was happening and figure out how to integrate both parts of my history into one coherent sense of self. During our session, I completely broke down and admitted I didn't know who I was anymore. The person I thought I was my entire life didn't actually exist, just a fake identity built on lies and stolen documents. But I also couldn't just become Katie from 20 years ago because I didn't remember being her, didn't remember my real parents or that yellow house or anything substantial. I felt stuck between two identities with no solid ground under my feet. Marlene listened carefully and said this identity crisis was completely normal given what I was going through. She promised we would work through integrating both parts of my history, so I could be one whole person instead of feeling split in two. A week after the DNA confirmation, I was sitting in Marlene's office during our third session when something shifted in my brain. A memory surfaced with vivid, startling clarity. Not like the fuzzy fragments I'd been having, but sharp and detailed and real. I suddenly remembered Aurelia and me playing with colorful blocks on a carpeted floor in a sunny room. We were building a tower together and laughing when it fell down. Then Daniel came in and picked both of us up, one in each arm, and spun us around in circles while we shrieked with laughter and delight. I could feel the movement, hear our voices, sense the pure joy and safety of that moment. The memory was so clear and powerful that I started crying right there in Marlene's office because I could feel the love that existed in that house before everything was destroyed. I called Daniel the second I left Marlene's office, my hands shaking as I held the phone. I told him about the memory and described it in detail, the blocks and the sunny room and him spinning us around. His voice got thick with emotion as he confirmed that yes, he used to spin us around exactly like that. It was one of our favorite games. Hearing him confirm the memory made it feel even more solid and real, like I was finally accessing my actual past instead of just fragments and guesses. He sounded so happy that I was starting to remember things, but also sad about everything we lost and all the years we should have spent together as a family. That same afternoon, Caroline called with news about the search warrant they'd executed on my adoptive parents' house. Police found documents hidden in the attic inside a locked box my adoptive father kept. The papers showed my adoptive mother paid $75,000 to someone identified in the documents only as the intermediary. The payment was made in cash installments over several months before I arrived at their house. Caroline said this was exactly the kind of evidence they needed to trace the network and potentially find others involved. She asked if I was okay, and I told her honestly that I didn't know, that everything felt overwhelming and surreal. She said that was understandable and reminded me I had Daniel and Marlene for support, that I didn't have to process this alone. 2 days after that conversation with Caroline, a lawyer called my apartment and said my adoptive father wanted to meet with me. The lawyer spent 10 minutes explaining that my adoptive father wanted to cooperate fully with investigators and believed he had information that could help find Aurelia and Matthias. I sat on my couch listening to this stranger talk about the man who raised me and felt nothing, but suspicion about what he really wanted. When I told Caroline about the request, she said the meeting might actually be valuable for the investigation and suggested I agree, but only if she was present in the room. I called the lawyer back and set it up for the next afternoon at the police station. Walking into that interview room and seeing my adoptive father sitting there with his lawyer made my stomach twist. He looked older than I remembered, with more gray hair and deeper lines around his eyes. Caroline sat next to me while Julian stood against the wall with his arms crossed, watching everything. My adoptive father started talking immediately, his words coming out fast like he'd been practicing what to say. He told them the adoption network was much bigger than anyone realized, and pulled out a folder with names and addresses of other couples who got children through the same intermediary. He said there might be dozens of illegally adopted kids from different sources all connected through this one person. Julian's expression changed when he heard that, this grim satisfaction crossing his face because this information could break the whole network wide open. My adoptive father kept talking, explaining how the intermediary operated and how many people he knew were involved. He gave specific details about payments and meetings and how the false documents were created. I watched him provide all this information and wondered if he was trying to help or just trying to reduce his own sentence. Then he looked directly at me for the first time since I walked in and said he genuinely didn't know I was kidnapped. His voice got quieter as he claimed he thought my biological mother had given me up because of poverty or addiction. He said the intermediary provided false documents and told them a convincing story about rescuing children from terrible situations. Part of me wanted to believe him because it was easier than thinking he knowingly bought a stolen child. But another part of me wasn't sure what to believe anymore, or if it even mattered whether he knew the truth. Caroline contacted me 3 days later and asked me to come back to the station. She spread papers across the table between us and explained they were investigating all the names my adoptive father provided. They'd already confirmed that at least 3 other children in the network were reported missing from different states. The realization that this network destroyed multiple families made me feel physically sick. I asked if any of those children might be Aurelia or Matthias, and Caroline said they were checking every possibility, but it would take time to track down all the leads. She looked tired, and I realized she was working around the clock on this case. That same week, Daniel called and invited me to have dinner at his house with his wife Meg. My hands shook as I agreed because these were people who were technically my family, but felt like complete strangers. I drove to their house in a quiet neighborhood and stood on the front porch for a full minute before I could make myself knock. Meg opened the door and immediately pulled me into a hug that felt warm and genuine. She led me inside, and the house was filled with photos on every wall. Meg showed me pictures of Daniel over the years and told me stories about how the search for us consumed so much of their life together. She pointed to a whole wall dedicated to the investigation with newspaper clippings and maps and photos of the mural from different years. During dinner, Daniel started sharing memories of our childhood that I desperately wanted to remember but couldn't. He told me about how Aurelia and I were inseparable, how we had our own secret language that nobody else understood. He said baby Matthias would laugh at everything we did, this huge belly laugh that would make everyone in the room start laughing too. He described how our parents were planning a big vacation to the beach right before everything was destroyed, how excited we all were about building sandcastles. Hearing these stories made the loss feel more real and devastating, because I could picture these moments but couldn't actually remember living them. I started crying at the dinner table and Meg reached over to squeeze my hand. Later that evening, Meg mentioned something that hit me hard. She said they never had children of their own, partly because Daniel felt he couldn't move forward with his own family while his siblings were still missing. She explained how every birthday and holiday was spent updating the mural or following new leads instead of building their own life. The weight of that sacrifice crushed me as I realized how much Daniel gave up to keep searching for us. I looked at him across the table and told him I was sorry for all the years he lost. Daniel shook his head and his eyes filled with tears as he said finding me made everything worth it, that he'd do it all again without hesitation. 3 weeks after my DNA confirmation, my phone started ringing constantly with calls from reporters. The news media got wind of the story, and it became regional headlines about the kidnapped child found after 20 years. A reporter from the local news station contacted me asking for an interview about being the found kidnapping victim. I refused immediately because the thought of talking about this publicly made me want to hide. But Caroline called me that evening and suggested that publicity might actually generate leads about Aurelia and Matthias. She said someone out there might recognize them from age-progressed photos and come forward with information. I thought about it for 2 days before finally agreeing to a carefully controlled interview with specific conditions about what questions they could ask. The news interview aired on a Thursday evening, and I watched it at Daniel's house with him and Meg. The segment included photos of Aurelia and Matthias age progressed to show what they might look like now at 23 and 21. Daniel and I both made public appeals asking anyone with information to come forward and provided the tip line number. Within an hour of the broadcast, Caroline called to say the response was overwhelming with dozens of tips already flooding the police hotline. She warned me that most would probably lead nowhere, but they'd investigate every single one. And I couldn't sleep that night thinking about all those calls and wondering if one of them might actually be real. 5 days after the news coverage, Caroline called with a lead that made my heart race. A woman had contacted the tip line saying she thought the age-progressed photo of Matthias looked exactly like a young man who worked at a grocery store in a city 3 hours away. Julian and Caroline drove there immediately to investigate and discovered the man was also adopted under suspicious circumstances around the same time I was. They collected a DNA sample after explaining the situation and told us the results would take a few days. Daniel called me every few hours during the waiting period, and we talked about what it would mean if it was really him, whether he'd have any memories of us, how we should approach meeting him if the DNA matched. The next 3 days felt like 3 years, and I kept checking my phone every 5 minutes even though I knew the lab would call Caroline first. I tried to go to work, but I couldn't focus on anything, and my boss finally told me to just take the rest of the week off because I was useless anyway. Daniel called me every single day, sometimes twice, and we'd talk for hours about what it would mean if the DNA matched. We discussed whether the young man would have any memories of us or the kidnapping, how we should approach meeting him if he was really Matthias, whether we should tell him everything at once or let him process it slowly. I felt like I was pulled in two different directions at the same time, terrified that it wouldn't be him, but also scared about what it would mean if it was. On the morning of the third day, Caroline called and I answered so fast I almost dropped my phone. She told me the results were back and asked if I could come to the station. I drove there going way too fast, and Daniel met me in the parking lot because Caroline had called him too. We walked in together holding hands like little kids and sat down in her office. Caroline looked at both of us with this expression that made my stomach drop, and she said the DNA results came back negative. The young man at the grocery store wasn't Matthias, just someone who happened to look similar to the age progression drawing. I felt something break inside my chest, and next to me, Daniel made this sound like he'd been punched. Caroline kept talking about how this is how investigations work, that you follow leads until one finally pays off, that this setback doesn't mean we won't find him. But I could barely hear her over the ringing in my ears because I'd let myself hope so much, and now that hope was just gone. Daniel and I sat in his car in the parking lot for almost an hour afterwards, both of us crying and not talking. When I finally got home, I called Marlene and asked if I could see her that day, instead of waiting for our regular appointment. She agreed, and I showed up at her office 2 hours later with swollen eyes and a headache. I told her about the negative DNA results, and how the disappointment felt like it was crushing me. She listened and then started asking me questions about my feelings toward my biological parents, who I don't remember, and my siblings, who I'm desperate to find. I admitted that I felt like I was mourning people I never really knew, that I was grieving for a family and a childhood that only exists in fragments and other people's memories. Marlene helped me understand that grief doesn't require perfect memories, that losing something you never got to have is still a real loss. We talked about my adoptive parents, and she said something that surprised me. She told me my feelings toward them could be complicated and messy, that I could acknowledge they raised me and I have some love for them, while also recognizing they participated in something deeply wrong. And I didn't have to choose between completely hating them or completely forgiving them, because real feelings about real people are never that simple. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into therapy sessions with Marlene twice a week instead of once. We worked through layers of complicated emotions about identity and belonging and family. She gave me exercises to help process the trauma and techniques to manage the anxiety that kept waking me up at 3 a.m. 6 weeks after the initial confrontation with my adoptive parents, my adoptive mother's lawyer contacted me asking if I would be willing to meet with her. I talked it over with Marlene and Daniel and Caroline, and finally decided I needed to hear what she had to say. We arranged to meet at a neutral location with both lawyers present. When my adoptive mother walked into the room, she looked terrible, like she hadn't slept in weeks. Her hair was greasy and she'd lost weight, and there were dark circles under her eyes that reminded me of Daniel's. She sat down across from me and her hands were shaking. Her lawyer started talking, but she interrupted him and looked right at me. She said she was desperate for a child after years of infertility and multiple failed adoptions, that the adoption agencies kept rejecting her and her husband for reasons she never fully understood. She told me about how the intermediary approached them at a support group for couples struggling with infertility, how this woman promised she could help them. My adoptive mother's voice broke when she admitted she had suspicions that something wasn't right about how quickly everything happened and how much cash was required. But she said she wanted a baby so badly that she convinced herself not to ask too many questions, that she told herself the intermediary was just helping a birth mother who needed money. She looked at me with tears running down her face and said that loving me and raising me was real, even if how she got me was wrong, that she was sorry for the damage this caused to everyone. I sat there listening and feeling this complicated mix of anger and sadness and something that might have been pity. I told her I wasn't ready to forgive her, and might never be ready. But I also said I needed time to process everything and figure out what kind of relationship, if any, we could have going forward. She nodded and said she understood, that she would cooperate fully with investigators and accept whatever consequences came. Her lawyer looked relieved that I wasn't screaming or making threats. After she left, I sat in my car for a long time trying to sort through my feelings. 2 weeks later, Caroline called with news that made my heart race. Julian had broken a major lead in the network investigation. They'd located and arrested the intermediary who arranged multiple illegal adoptions, including mine. The woman was in her 60s now and initially refused to cooperate with investigators. But when Julian showed her the evidence they'd collected and explained the charges she was facing, she agreed to provide information in exchange for a reduced sentence. She confirmed she was paid by the people who kidnapped us to find buyers for 3 small children. She gave them names and details about the network that stretched across multiple states. Julian said they were already making more arrests based on her information. 3 days after that arrest, Caroline called again, and this time her voice sounded different, more careful. She asked if I could come to the station because they had new information about Matthias. I called Daniel immediately, and we met at the police station within an hour. Julian was there too, and he had a file folder in front of him. He told us the intermediary had provided details about where she delivered Matthias 20 years ago to a couple in another state. Investigators tracked down that couple and discovered that Matthias was removed from their care by Child Protective Services years ago due to abuse. He'd entered the foster system as a young child, and the trail went cold because he moved through multiple placements over the years. They were still trying to locate his current whereabouts, but it was complicated because he'd been in the system under different names. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. The idea of Matthias being abused while I was living in a relatively safe home made me feel sick. Daniel put his head in his hands, and I could see his shoulders shaking. Julian kept talking about how they were searching foster care databases and following leads, but I could barely process what he was saying. When I got home that night, I couldn't get out of bed. I called in sick to work the next day and the day after that. I kept thinking about a little boy being hurt and scared with no family to protect him. Daniel called and we talked on the phone for hours, both of us crying and trying to support each other through the horror of what we'd learned. He told me he felt like he'd failed Matthias by not finding him sooner. I told him it wasn't his fault, but I knew he didn't believe me because I was struggling with the same guilt. I made an emergency appointment with Marlene and told her about the survivor's guilt that was eating me alive. She listened and then said something that cut through the fog in my brain. She told me that none of this was my fault, that I was a victim too, even if my experience was different from Matthias's. She said that falling apart wouldn't help find him or Aurelia, that I needed to stay functional, so I could be there when we finally located them. She gave me tools to manage the guilt and the intrusive thoughts about what Matthias might have suffered. We worked on separating what I could control from what I couldn't, on focusing my energy toward the future instead of drowning in the past. 2 weeks after that therapy session, Julian called Daniel with an update about the foster system search. The record showed Matthias had aged out of care when he turned 18 and had been living under a different last name that one of his foster families gave him. Julian found a current driver's license and address in a city about 6 hours away from here. He said they were sending local police to make contact and confirm it was really him before getting our hopes up again. I spent those next 3 days barely sleeping, jumping every time my phone rang. Daniel called me twice a day just to check in, and we'd talk for hours about what it would mean if this was really Matthias, whether he'd remember anything, how we should handle meeting him. On the third day, Caroline called and I knew from her voice before she even spoke that it was good news. She told me they found him and the DNA test came back as a match. Matthias was alive, working construction, and had no idea he was a missing person, or that his parents were murdered. When the police showed up and told him about the kidnapping and showed him photos of our dead parents, he apparently fell apart completely. Caroline said he was in shock and they had a counselor with him, but he wanted to meet us as soon as possible. I called Daniel right away and we decided to drive there together the next morning. Neither of us could sleep that night and Daniel picked me up at 5 in the morning even though we didn't need to leave until 7. We stopped for coffee 3 times during the drive because we were both too nervous to sit still. When we finally pulled up to the police station where Matthias was waiting, I felt like I might throw up. We walked inside and Caroline met us in the lobby, then led us back to a private room. Matthias was sitting at a table and when he looked up at us, I stopped breathing for a second because he looked exactly like our father in the old photos Daniel had shown me. He had the same jawline and the same dark eyes and the same way of holding his shoulders. He stood up slowly and stared at us like he wasn't sure we were real. His first words were asking if we were really his family, if this was actually happening. Daniel walked over and put his hands on Matthias's shoulders and said yes. We were his brother and sister and we'd been looking for him for 20 years. Matthias started crying and Daniel pulled him into a hug while I stood there trying not to fall apart. After a few minutes, we all sat down and Caroline gave us some privacy. Matthias kept looking back and forth between Daniel and me like he was trying to memorize our faces. He told us he didn't remember anything about our original family or the kidnapping because he was only a year old when it happened. The people who bought him kept him for a few years, but they were bad to him, and child services took him away when he was 4. He spent the rest of his childhood bouncing between different foster homes, and most of them were either neglectful or abusive. He said he grew up believing his real parents had abandoned him, because that's what everyone told him. Learning that he was actually stolen from a family who wanted him, and that our parents were murdered trying to protect us, was changing everything he thought he knew about himself. We sat there for hours while Daniel pulled out photos and told stories about our parents and our childhood. Matthias listened with this look on his face that was half wonder and half pain, touching the photos like he was trying to connect with people he'd never actually know. He kept asking questions about what our parents were like and what the house looked like and whether he had any baby pictures. I held his hand across the table and told him we were going to figure this out together, that he wasn't alone anymore, and we were his family now. By the time we left the police station, it was dark outside, and we'd been there for almost 6 hours. Matthias said he needed a few days to process everything, but he wanted to stay in touch and see us again soon. Daniel gave him his phone number and address and told him he could call anytime, day or night. On the drive home, Daniel and I were both quiet for a long time, just trying to process that we'd actually found Matthias after all these years. A week later, Julian contacted us about new developments in finding Aurelia. The intermediary had finally provided information about the couple who bought her 20 years ago. The investigators tracked them down and discovered they'd moved to another state years ago. When police interviewed them, they claimed Aurelia had run away when she was 16, and they never reported it because they were scared of getting caught for the illegal adoption. This couple admitted they treated Aurelia badly during her childhood with them. They said she was rebellious and angry and they couldn't control her. They had no idea where she went when she left and they didn't even try to find her. Julian told us he was furious at their negligence and they were arrested right away, but we still had no idea where Aurelia was now, or even if she was still alive. The news about Aurelia running away at 16 terrified me, because anything could have happened to her in the 7 years since then. Daniel decided to do another media interview about finding Matthias and the ongoing search for Aurelia. The news coverage generated dozens of new tips, and Daniel spent a whole weekend updating the mural to show that I'd been found, and Matthias had been found, with only Aurelia's image remaining as an age progression. Standing in front of that mural with Matthias beside me felt completely surreal. 2 weeks after we found Matthias, a woman called the tip line saying she thought she might know Aurelia. She described a coworker at a restaurant in a neighboring state who matched the age progression photo and had mentioned being adopted under strange circumstances. The woman said this coworker went by a different name and seemed to have serious trust issues with everyone around her. Caroline and Julian decided to investigate this lead really carefully because they didn't want to scare someone who might be Aurelia by just showing up and confronting her. They drove to the restaurant and made contact with the young woman during her shift. They explained the situation as gently as they could and asked if she'd be willing to provide a DNA sample. Caroline said the woman was suspicious and scared at first, but after they showed her photos of our murdered parents and explained the whole story about the kidnapping, she agreed to the test. The waiting for those DNA results felt like the longest 3 days of my life. I couldn't sleep and barely ate anything because my brain kept spinning with the possibility that we'd actually found Aurelia after all these years. Daniel called me twice a day just to check in, and I could hear in his voice that he was going through the same thing. Matthias stayed at Daniel's house during the wait so they could be together when the news came. On the third day, my phone rang and Caroline's name appeared on the screen. My hands shook so bad I almost dropped the phone before I answered. She said the words I'd been desperate to hear. It was a match. Aurelia was alive and we'd found her. I actually screamed out loud with pure joy and started crying so hard I could barely breathe. I called Daniel right away, and he was already crying too because Caroline had called him first. He told me to come over immediately because he and Matthias needed to see me. When I got to Daniel's house, the three of us just held each other and cried for what felt like hours. After 20 years of loss and searching and not knowing, we were all accounted for. Our parents didn't die for nothing because their children survived. We'd been stolen and separated and raised by strangers, but we made it through and found each other again. The next challenge was actually meeting Aurelia because Caroline told us she was really hesitant about the whole thing. She'd spent years building walls around herself and not trusting anyone after the way her adoptive parents treated her. Caroline said it made sense that Aurelia would be scared and suspicious after everything she'd been through. Caroline arranged for a therapist who works with trauma survivors to meet with Aurelia first and help her process the news before we all showed up wanting to be her family. We had to wait several more days while Aurelia worked through her shock and decided if she even wanted contact with us. Those days were almost harder than waiting for the DNA results because we knew she was out there and alive, but she might not want anything to do with us. Daniel kept reminding me that we had to respect whatever Aurelia needed and not push her, but the waiting was killing all of us. Matthias admitted he was scared that Aurelia would reject us because he knew what it felt like to not trust anyone after years of bad treatment. When Aurelia finally agreed to meet, Caroline set it up at a neutral location with therapists present for support. We gathered in a private room at a community center and I felt so nervous I thought I might throw up. Daniel and Matthias were both quiet and tense beside me as we waited. Then the door opened and Aurelia walked in. She looked defensive and scared with her arms crossed over her chest and her eyes darting around the room like she was looking for an escape route. I stared at her face and saw myself in her features mixed with elements of our mother from the photos Daniel had shown me. She had the same nose as me and the same shape to her eyes. Daniel stood up slowly and took a careful step toward her. He said her name really gently, and something in her expression cracked open. Her eyes filled with tears even though she was clearly trying to hold them back. The therapist encouraged her to sit down, and Aurelia moved to a chair but kept herself positioned near the door. I wanted to run over and hug her, but I could tell that would freak her out, so I stayed in my seat. Aurelia started talking after a few minutes of awkward silence. She admitted she'd always felt like something was wrong with her adoption story. Her adoptive parents told her they got her from an agency, but they were always really vague about the details and got mad if she asked questions. She had these fragments of memories that didn't match anything they told her about her early childhood. Seeing us in person and hearing the full story about our murdered parents made pieces click into place for her. She said she was angry about everything that got stolen from us, and grieving for parents she couldn't even remember. But she also seemed relieved to finally have real answers and actual family, instead of the people who bought her and then treated her like garbage. She looked at me and said we had the same mouth and the same hands. I held up my hands next to hers and she was right. Our hands looked almost identical. Matthias showed her a scar on his arm and asked if she remembered him falling off a bike when we were little. Aurelia stared at the scar for a long time and then said maybe she did remember something like that, but she wasn't sure if it was real or just her brain making things up. The four of us sat together for hours that first day. Daniel brought out the folder of photos and documents he'd been carrying around for weeks. He told stories about our parents and what our house was like, and what he remembered about each of us as little kids. Matthias, Aurelia, and I listened like we were starving for this information about where we came from. We compared our fragmented memories and experiences and found connections we didn't expect. Aurelia remembered a yellow room with sunlight coming through the windows. I remembered the same room. Matthias couldn't remember the house at all, but he said hearing us describe it made him feel something. Daniel showed us photos of Aurelia and me as toddlers playing together in the backyard. We were holding hands in one picture and had matching overalls on. Aurelia stared at that photo for a really long time, and then said she thought she remembered me. She said she remembered us being together all the time and feeling safe when we were playing. I started crying again because having someone else remember even a tiny piece of our real childhood made it feel more real. Over the following weeks, we met regularly as a family and started the slow process of actually building relationships. It was really complicated because we were basically strangers who just happened to share DNA and a terrible history. We didn't know each other's favorite foods or what kind of music we liked or how we spent our free time. Aurelia was still pretty guarded, and sometimes she'd cancel plans at the last minute because she got overwhelmed. Matthias struggled with anger about his foster care experiences, and sometimes that anger came out at weird times. I was dealing with my own mess of feelings about my adoptive parents and what they'd done. But there was also this connection between us that none of us had felt before with anyone else. When we were together, something just clicked into place. We belonged to each other in a way that went deeper than just knowing someone. Daniel said it was like we recognized each other on some level that went beyond memory. Meg welcomed all of us into her and Daniel's home for regular family dinners. She cooked these huge meals and set the table with 5 places, and it felt both strange and right to be sitting around a table as a family. Meg told me privately that she was so happy to see Daniel finally have his siblings back after all these years of searching. She said the search had consumed so much of their life together, and she'd started to worry he'd never find closure. Now she was watching him laugh and joke with us, and she could see the weight lifting off his shoulders. Daniel admitted during one dinner that having us back was the best thing that ever happened to him, but he also felt this deep grief that our parents never got to see this reunion. He said our mom and dad would have been so proud of how we all survived and found our way back to each other. We raised our glasses in a toast to our parents, and I felt this connection to people I'd never really known, but who died trying to protect us. The legal proceedings against everyone involved in the kidnapping and adoption fraud network started moving forward. My adoptive parents both accepted plea deals to avoid trial. My adoptive mother got a shorter sentence because she cooperated with investigators and gave them information about the network. My adoptive father got more time because he'd been less helpful. I went to their sentencing hearing and watched them stand in front of the judge. My adoptive mother looked at me with tears running down her face, but I couldn't bring myself to feel much of anything for her right then. The intermediary who arranged all the illegal adoptions got hit with serious prison time for her role in trafficking multiple children over the years. The prosecutor read out a list of all the families she'd destroyed and all the children she'd helped steal. Hearing that list made me feel sick because our story was just one of so many. The couple who bought Aurelia and then let her run away at 16 got harsh sentences for child abuse and neglect on top of the adoption fraud charges. Aurelia came to their sentencing and I sat beside her holding her hand. She didn't cry or show much emotion, but I could feel her hand shaking in mine. When the judge announced their sentence, Aurelia squeezed my hand really tight. Matthias's abusive foster parents also got investigated and ended up facing charges for how they treated him and other kids in their care. Watching all these people finally be held accountable gave us some sense that justice was happening. It didn't give us back the 20 years we lost or undo all the trauma we went through, but it was something. At least they couldn't hurt any more kids. Joel Ferguson, the district attorney handling the case, asked to meet with all 4 of us after the main sentencing hearings finished. We gathered in his office and he told us something that made all the pain feel slightly more bearable. Our case had led to the rescue and identification of 8 other children who'd been trafficked through the same network over the years. Some of those kids got reunited with their biological families who'd been searching for them, just like Daniel searched for us. Others at least finally learned the truth about their origins and where they really came from. Joel said our willingness to come forward and testify and share our story publicly had broken the whole network open. Without us, those other 8 kids might never have been found. Knowing that our nightmare helped save other people and reunite other families made me feel like maybe something good came out of all this horror after all. 6 months passed and Daniel arranged for all 4 of us to meet at the cemetery where our parents were buried. I drove there on a cold morning in early spring and found Daniel, Matthias, and Aurelia already waiting by the graves. Daniel had brought flowers for each of us to place, white roses that he said were our mother's favorite. We stood in a line looking at the 2 headstones with our parents' names and the dates that marked when they died trying to protect us. I placed my roses on our mother's grave and felt this weird mix of grief for someone I couldn't really remember, but who I knew had loved me. Matthias went next and his hands shook as he set down his flowers. Aurelia took longer, standing there staring at the graves like she was trying to will back memories that wouldn't come. Daniel placed his roses last, and then he put his arms around all 3 of us, and we stood there together promising out loud that we'd honor their memory by being the family they wanted us to be. The wind picked up and scattered some petals across the grass, and I thought about how our parents never got to see us grow up, but at least we found each other. Marlene scheduled regular therapy sessions with all 4 of us both individually and as a group. I went to her office every week and we worked through the complicated mess of feelings I had about everything that happened. Matthias came to some of the group sessions, and I could see how angry he was about the foster homes he'd been stuck in, the families who hurt him when they were supposed to take care of him. He'd clench his fists when talking about it and sometimes had to leave the room to calm down. Aurelia struggled with trusting any of us, even though the DNA proved we were family. She'd sit in therapy with her arms crossed and give short answers until Marlene would gently push her to open up more. I spent sessions talking about my adoptive parents and how I didn't know what to feel about people who raised me, but also stole me from my real family. Marlene helped me understand that having mixed feelings was normal, and I didn't have to choose between hating them completely or forgiving them completely. During one group session, Daniel admitted something that clearly had been eating at him for a while. He said that finding us was the best thing that ever happened to him, but he also felt guilty about all the years we suffered while he was safe. His voice cracked when he talked about how Matthias got abused in foster care, and Aurelia ended up on the streets, and I grew up with people who bought me like I was property. Meg reached over and took his hand and told him he couldn't blame himself for what happened when he was just a teenager who lost everything too. Marlene backed her up and explained that Daniel was also a victim, a 15-year-old kid who came home to find his parents dead and his siblings gone. She said he'd spent 20 years searching and never gave up, and that's what mattered. Matthias spoke up and said none of us blamed Daniel for not finding us sooner. Aurelia nodded in agreement, and I told Daniel that he saved us by never stopping the search, by painting that mural every year until I finally saw it and recognized myself. As we got closer to the 1-year anniversary of when I first walked past the mural and stopped to really look at it, Daniel called me with an idea. He wanted to paint a new mural, but not another age progression of what he imagined we looked like. This time he wanted to paint us as we actually were now, all 4 siblings together, to show that we survived and found each other. He said the old mural had been about hope and searching, but the new one would be about reunion and survival. I loved the idea immediately, and called Matthias and Aurelia to tell them about it. Matthias thought it was perfect, and Aurelia agreed after thinking about it for a minute. We met outside the coffee shop on a sunny afternoon to take the photo that would be the basis for the new mural. Daniel set up his camera on a tripod and positioned us carefully. He stood in the middle since he was the oldest, with Matthias on one side and Aurelia and me on the other. We all had our arms around each other, actually touching and connected. Daniel set the timer and ran to get in position, and we all smiled for the camera. Our smiles were complicated, full of grief and trauma and missing 20 years, but they were also genuine because we'd survived and we were together. Daniel took several photos to make sure he got one that worked, and then we all looked at them on his camera screen. Seeing the 4 of us standing there together made something shift in my chest. Daniel started painting the new mural the following week, and we all came by regularly to watch his progress. He worked for hours each day, carefully transferring the photo onto the wall and adding details that made us look real and alive. The coffee shop owner came out to watch sometimes, and I saw her crying one afternoon as she realized the search that had consumed 20 years was finally complete. Other people from town stopped to watch too, and some of them remembered when the original tragedy happened. The mural slowly transformed from a desperate hope into a celebration that we'd made it through. Daniel painted our faces with care, making sure to capture Matthias's smile and Aurelia's cautious expression, and the way my hand rested on Daniel's shoulder. The unveiling happened on the exact anniversary of the day I first walked past the mural and stopped dead in my tracks. A small crowd gathered, including Caroline and Julian, who'd worked so hard on the investigation, and Marlene, who'd helped us process everything, and Meg, who'd supported Daniel through 20 years of searching. Daniel stood in front of the covered mural with the 4 of us beside him, and gave a short speech about never giving up hope even when things seemed impossible. He talked about our parents and how they died trying to protect us, and how the best way to honor them was to be the family they wanted us to be. Then he pulled the covering off, and everyone saw the 4 of us painted there together, alive and real and found. People clapped and some cried, and the coffee shop owner hugged each of us. After the unveiling, we all went to Daniel and Meg's house for a private family dinner. Meg had cooked a huge meal, and we sat around their dining room table passing dishes and talking about the future. Daniel asked how we'd stay connected since we lived in different cities, and Matthias joked that we should have annual reunions where we all got together. Aurelia immediately agreed, and I could see her walls coming down more each time we spent time together. We talked about visiting each other and doing video calls and making sure we didn't lose each other again after spending 20 years apart. Meg suggested we start a group chat so we could stay in touch daily, and we all pulled out our phones right there to set it up. I met with Marlene alone a few days later to talk about my adoptive mother. She'd be getting out of prison in a few years, and I needed to figure out what kind of relationship I wanted with her, if any. Marlene helped me understand that I could acknowledge she raised me, and that I had some love for her while also maintaining boundaries about what she did. I didn't have to forgive her completely, or cut her off completely. I could have limited contact and protect myself while still recognizing she was part of my life for 20 years. It was complicated and messy, but Marlene said that was normal and okay. I decided I'd maintain some contact after her release, but I wasn't ready yet, and might not be for a long time. Aurelia called me excited one afternoon to say she'd enrolled in college classes with financial help from Daniel. She wanted to study social work, so she could help other kids who ended up in bad situations like she did. Matthias started seeing a therapist regularly to work through his foster care trauma and got a better job with benefits. I kept going to my own therapy and started volunteering with an organization that helped trafficking victims. Turning my pain into something that could help other people made me feel like maybe all the horrible things that happened could lead to something good. We were all building more stable lives and healing slowly, and we had each other to lean on when things got hard. A few months later, the 4 of us took a road trip together to see the house where we lived before everything happened. Daniel drove and Matthias sat in front while Aurelia and I were in the back seat. Nobody talked much on the way there because we were all nervous about what this would feel like. When we pulled up to the address, I recognized it immediately from my fragmented memories, even though it had been painted a different color, and the yard looked completely different. We all got out of the car and stood on the sidewalk just staring at it. The current owners had added a porch and changed the windows, but the basic shape was the same. Aurelia grabbed my hand and squeezed it hard. Matthias walked closer and touched the mailbox like he was trying to connect with something he couldn't remember. Daniel's eyes were wet when he pointed to an upstairs window and told us that was our parents' bedroom. We stood there for almost an hour just looking and remembering what we could. I had more memory flashes of running through rooms and playing in that yard. Aurelia said she remembered a tire swing that used to hang from the big tree, but it was gone now. We held hands in a circle on the sidewalk, and Daniel said we needed to promise to keep our parents' memory alive by telling their story and being the family they wanted us to be. We all agreed and stood there together feeling connected to them and to each other. A few weeks after that visit, Daniel showed up at my apartment with a wrapped package. He'd painted a smaller version of the reunion mural for each of us to keep in our homes. I unwrapped it carefully and saw the four of us painted there together, just like the big mural downtown. When I hung it on my living room wall, I stood back and looked at all our faces. The mix of emotions hit me hard because we'd lost so much time and carried so much pain from what happened to us. But we'd also found each other against impossible odds, and that mattered more than anything else. I texted my siblings a photo of the painting on my wall, and they all sent back pictures of theirs hanging in their places too. 1 year after I first discovered the truth, I went back to the big mural downtown on the anniversary. I stood there looking at the four of us painted together and realized something had shifted inside me. I wasn't just the person my adoptive parents raised under lies anymore. I was also Katie who came home to her real family. Both parts were true, and both parts made me who I was now. I was building a future with Daniel and Aurelia and Matthias, while also accepting that my past was complicated and messy. For the first time in my whole life, I felt like I actually knew who I was and where I belonged.